Good morning. Thank you for showing up this morning, because for those of you that are here in person, not easy. We're entering into Canadian winter, and I realize that there's snow on the ground, a few inches at least, several centimeters. For those of you that are online, I know a few of you, a very good morning to you as well, and a welcome. I'd like to start with a reminder, because my wife always tells me to make sure that we place our messages in context, because she sometimes doesn't know where we are. Where we are on this journey for 5 years. We're looking at a journey through the entire Bible. And as I've mentioned before, it is not a verse-by-verse journey. Oh, I wish I could do that. We will go verse by verse through books and very closely to other passages in the future. But we're starting off with a tour of the Bible to help people get an idea of the overall theme of the red line, redemptive line that goes throughout Scripture. It's a good idea to do that because we forget what it's all about at times. And we forget the main messages. And also, by going through every book of the Bible, it's a discipline for all of us, but particularly for the speakers, for me as a pastor. I need to go through every book because it's so easy to ignore certain books of the Bible. And in particular, we're going through Haggai and Zechariah right now. It's really easy to miss out on that. There's an amazing message, and the timing, I believe, is perfect for our congregation. The message is a wonderful message for all of us that is very timely, and if you don't force yourself to go through these books, you'll miss it. Let me give you a summary of the series that we're going through, this arc in the month of November. And by the way, it's also our missions month, which also worked out really nicely. But there's meaty, I find it very fulfilling, very satisfying themes in Haggai and Zechariah. On November 2nd, at the beginning of this month, we started with a talk about renewal of our hearts, rebuilding for God's glory. They're rebuilding the temple, right? God was telling them to get back to job. Then we talked about God's presence strengthening our weary hands on November 9th, because we're not doing it by ourselves. It's not our job. God is doing it, right? And then thirdly, on November 16th, we talked about the Spirit ensuring that there's going to be a greater glory ahead, something to look forward to, right? Fits very nicely into our season. And then on November 23rd, God's people become his witness to the nations. Now, my friend Jordan didn't really go through that very much, the passage, but he talked about missions, overseas missions. He challenged us, made you think about whether or not it's just local missions or just overseas missions. I think there needs to be a balance. We're going to talk about that today a little bit as well. And now today, perfect for our Advent season, the first week of Advent, the King comes to fulfill his global peace. But it's not what you expect. In fact, it's kind of like, ever been really disappointed? Right? I've been disappointed at some things. For example, when I was younger, I'd see a trailer. It's so wonderfully done, these trailers, about upcoming movies, and you think, wow, look at all that action. And you realize the only thing they show you in the trailer are the highlights of the entire movie, and there's nothing else that's really good in the entire movie. Or it's a great mystery, or a great romance, and you realize that's really secondary to the whole thing. Or they show you a star, and that star is just like one tiny role. Or it talks, you get all this great build-up. You're going to go on a family vacation, Disney World, go back to Asia, to the homeland or whatever. And you think, oh, everything's worked up towards it. And then you got there and, it's a little bit of a letdown. I remember my twin brother went to Asia a couple of times. One time he went to the Great Wall of China. He was really looking forward to it because, that's our background. And he was saying, hey, Fred, I really want looking forward to this Great Wall of China thing. And he went there, and he went on the hottest summer ever, it seems. And he went on the worst day, crowds, and he climbed up these steps that were so uneven that he kept on having falling. And when he got to the top, he looked around and he goes, oh, okay, that's it. And he got back down, and it took 3 days for him to recover in the air conditioning of his hotel. Okay? Bit of a disappointment there. Well, the Jews were looking forward to the Messiah for many decades, millennial. And here we are, a prophet giving us a taste of what to expect about the Messiah, the king that's going to come. And when they got there, when Jesus came, there was a bit of a disappointment. But I'll get to that in a bit. Key theological thread, but before I go forward, it was a disappointment to them. But in the big scheme of things, it was much more than they expected, because it was much more far beyond what they wanted in a Messiah. It was someone to save the whole world, not just the Jews. There is a theological thread that goes through all this. There is renewal in Haggai chapter 1. God revives his people to rebuild what honors him. He does it, and it's for a purpose. Number 2, there's reassurance in Haggai 2 and Zechariah 4. God promises his glory and empowers by his Spirit. Not by might, nor by power, nor by strength, but by my Spirit. His mission is sustained not by might, not our own doing. Oh, sure, we're involved, and we have lots to do, by the way. Right? We'll talk about that. But ultimately, it's God who will set it up. He's going to set it up for us. Reach, Zechariah 8. A renewed people become a magnet for the nations. They reach out. Missions flow naturally from the revived and spirit-filled community. That's why we do missions. Right? And revelation, Zechariah 9. The king himself embodies God's mission of peace to all nations. Christ is the ultimate missionary. God coming to us. God in the scriptures, through the Old Testament and the New Testament, yes, he has a place of worship that draws all nations, but essentially it's God reaching out. In Acts, when we get to Acts, we'll talk about that. God reaches out. That's why we're a missionary people, a missionary faith. As we conclude our series in Haggai and Zechariah today, on this first Sunday of Advent, we arrive at one of the most breathtaking prophecies of Advent. A prophecy that is both gentle and revolutionary, humble yet victorious. Zechariah 9:9-10. It doesn't merely predict the arrival of a king. It reveals the very heart of God's redemptive plan. And if you look at it very carefully, if the Jews knew what they were looking at, they would have reacted very differently to Christ's arrival. Advent is a season of expectation, waiting, longing, and preparing, but it's not a passive waiting. It is a kind of waiting where God's people lean forward in hope because God is fulfilling his promises, shaping hearts, preparing the world for the coming of the true king. Let's step now into Zechariah's vision and behold this king, first in his humility and then in his triumph. We first see the humble king in Zechariah 9:9. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. That's all the Jewish people, right? See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Zechariah 9:9 paints the breathtaking picture of Israel's true king arriving not on a war horse, but on a donkey, a paradox of majesty and meekness. The New Testament writer sees at that moment as a prophetic lens through which to understand Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. When he rides in later, remember Palm Sunday, the gospel accounts explicitly identify that event with the fulfillment of this prophecy in Zechariah. Matthew 21:4-5, John 12:14-15, Mark 11:1-10, and Luke 19:28-40. So the evangelists, when they look at the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, aren't narrating just a historical moment. They are declaring that the long-anticipated king has come. This is the fulfillment of prophecy in the very manner that God foretold, humble, peaceful, yet unmistakably royal. By connecting Zechariah's vision to Jesus' triumphal entry, the Gospels proclaim that the Messiah's kingdom breaks into the world, not through force, but through sacrificial love. The one who comes righteous and victorious is the same one who will lay down his life within days. And in this way, Zechariah 9:9 becomes a signpost and an invitation. Behold your king. See how he comes and perceive in his humility the true nature of God's salvation. You know, the Hebrew behind this passage in Zechariah, Jili Rabbah, it is a command. And it opens up the command to rejoice, but not just to funny joke. This is to rejoice greatly. It is a word that means an eruption of joy, a joy that breaks out of confinement. God is calling his people to celebrate before the king, before he even arrives, because he is trustworthy and because his coming is certain. The unexpected humility of the king, though, is what shocks the Jews. Kings in the ancient world they came in with war horses, right? Magnificent stallions. They arrived with spectacle, displays of power, and armies behind them. Like today, you hear stories of kings and queens that arrive, right? The king, the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un or something like that. He arrives in this big black limo with what? All these security guards, like the Secret Service. They're actually running around him. They're jogging around the limo. Now, Trump arrives down an escalator, a golden escalator, in a really expensive casino or hotel or whatever. Other king, and nowadays when you arrive, it's even more spectacular, right? Show how important you are. You arrive with pomp and with majesty, with splendor. But Zechariah says that your king comes gentle. He's approachable. He's accessible. He's near. He's humble. On a donkey, an animal associated not with war, but with peace, with labor. In our world, totally different, the motorcades. But there's a stark contrast. Sometimes we don't recognize greatness before us. Some of you know this story. It's a pretty famous story. It's about the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth, when she was alive. Years ago, her royal protection officer, right, security guard, personal security guard, Richard Griffin, he revealed that once the Queen was walking through Balmoral Castle, the grounds of Balmoral Castle, and it's open to the public, and 2 American tourists were there, and she was dressed in casual garb. She wasn't in any of her queenly stuff, and they didn't recognize her, of course, and she told them, she asked who they were and where they're from, they talked a little small talk, and then they asked her, have you met the Queen? And she goes, no, but my friend here, Richard Griffin, he's met her on many occasions. She has a great sense of humor. And so they said, oh, can you take a picture of us with this guy? So they went and took pictures of this royal bodyguard. The Queen did the picture taking with the tourists. And then later on, just as a side thought, they said, oh, can we get a picture with you too? So they got a picture with the Queen, right? And then the Queen later on goes to her bodyguard. I just want to see their faces when their friends tell them who the person in the picture was, right? They had no idea, right? When Jesus first came, they had no idea. The average person, average Jew, had no idea. This is the humility of the King who comes to us, not demanding attention, not forcing his presence, but stepping into our lives quietly and powerfully. Is he doing that to you today? Oh, hear this. When God comes close to you, he does not come with intimidation. He comes with gentleness. When your heart is bruised, when your spirit is overwhelmed, when your failures feel heavy, he comes humbly, not harshly. He comes gently, not judgmentally. But humility does not mean weakness by far. The same King who comes gently also comes, in verse 10, triumphantly. I will take away the chariots from Ephraim and the war horses from Jerusalem, and the battle bow will be broken. He will proclaim peace to the nations. His rule will extend from sea to sea, and from the river to that's Euphrates, right, to the ends of the earth. There are lots of prophecies connected to these 2 verses. When we move from Zechariah 9:9 to Zechariah 9:10, we pass over what Roy Gingrich, he's a pretty famous Old Testament scholar, he wrote that we pass over what they describe as a prophetic valley, a gap of at least 2,000 years between Christ's first advent and Christ's second advent. In majesty, his second one. Zechariah 9:9 shows us the King arriving lowly and riding on a donkey. But Zechariah 9:10 leaps forward to the day when he will rule from sea to sea, bringing universal peace by his own authority. The New Testament fills in this mountain range with this view of prophecy, what scholars call a prophetic foreshortening, right? The mountain peaks of prophecy. The prophet shows us the major events aligned as the peaks. You're in the top of a mountain, you're looking out, and you see like 2 or 3 different mountains in the distance, but there's huge valleys in between. It could be miles and miles, kilometers and kilometers apart. But that long stretches of time are in between. The first mountain peak is, Christ's first time on the earth, his advent and his also on Calvary. The next is the king returning in glory. And the second advent is not going to be gentle or hidden. It will be majestic, overwhelming, and for those who have resisted him, it's going to be terrifying. Jesus himself says in Matthew 24:30, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds with power and great glory. Paul writes in 2 Thessalonians 1, verse 7 to 10, when Christ is going to be revealed in blazing fire, bringing relief to his people, but judgment upon those who have rejected him. The same king who once came lowly on a donkey will return riding in the clouds and with every knee bowing and every heart confronted with his glory. So Roy Gingrich, in his commentary on Haggai and Zechariah, he writes this: at his second coming, Christ will cut off the instruments of war from his own people. Christ will bring universal peace. Christ will exercise universal dominion. He'll deliver his people from the pit. The Lord will give Israel victory over her enemies. Christ will save his people from their sins. Christ will bless his people with temporal blessings. The first arrival might have been a dud to some. The second will be terrifying to others. A kingdom without violence, though, because of Christ's authority. This king ends war, not by overpowering his enemies, but by transforming them. This prophecy fulfills in Jesus. His victory is won not through force, but through sacrificial love, his death on the cross. His triumph disarms not only armies, but fear, shame, guilt, and the power of sin. It will finally bring peace. We will have peace on this earth someday. Look around you. What do you see? A lot of non-peace. Wars in the Ukraine, in Asia, in Africa, in South America, or in Central America. An anxious world full of wars, fearful of the future. There's family strains. There might be war in your own family. Financial pressure. I know some of you are really, you're buckling under the weight of debt or impending debt. But the king brings peace. He brings shalom that restores and settles and renews. If this is the king who comes, humble and triumphant, how then should we respond today? What's the message for us today? Well, at least let me share with you a few. But basically, we are to behold and rejoice. See, your king is coming. That's what it starts off with in verse 9. Now, I'm going to get to rejoicing more later, but why can we rejoice? Is because we're on the winning team. That's guaranteed. Faith-fueled confidence. We're humble, but we have a faith-fueled confidence. But Zechariah's first call is not merely to rejoice, but it is to see. And the Advent is a season of holy noticing. Looking beyond the noise to see the presence of God breaking into our lives. Right? Behold, see, perceive. Because Christ is not always going to come to your life in a blaring way. It'll be subtle. Just as Israel needed perceptive hearts to recognize the Messiah at his first coming, entering not on a war horse, right? We need to sharpen our perceptions for his presence now and his return to glory. Because the Advent is a look back, but it's also a look forward to his second coming. I'm going to cover that more in the weeks to come. But holy noticing keeps us from sleepwalking through life. It prepares us to welcome the King who is already at work in our homes. It prepares us to welcome him by preparing our homes, our families, our inner worlds. When we have a group come to your house, you have guests, no matter how important they are, you tend to do things. You prepare your house, you clean up, you get rid of the dirt on the floor if you can, you rearrange furniture. Maybe even outside you shovel your walk, or you get rid of the leaves or whatever, you blow them out. You do something to prepare. And the more important the guest, the more amount of work you put into getting your house ready. Isn't that true? Some people I've known they bought furniture for guests because they have a large group or whatever. You fix up your kitchen. the second advent is Jesus coming again. We need to prepare our hearts, right? But we need to notice that he has already come and notice him working already now in our world. In the first advent, they didn't notice the majesty of Jesus coming as a little baby. That happens to us all the time in our world. We don't notice things. We are spiritually dull. It reminds me of that true story that you might have heard also about Joshua Bell, right? 2007, world-renowned violinist, played in all the biggest Carnegie Hall, all the biggest venues in this world. They did an experiment, and they filmed the whole thing. They stood on, you can watch it on video, YouTube. But he stood on a busy Washington, D.C. subway right after he played there in a concert hall nearby. And he stood during the morning rush hour and played some of the most beautiful music that was ever written. And it was on a violin that was worth more than most people's houses. It was an expensive violin. It was amazing music. It was a great free concert, right? You could buy tickets for his concert the day before. It would have cost hundreds of dollars, some going into the thousands of dollars scalped, right? But that morning, dressed as an ordinary commuter, Joshua Bell was almost entirely unnoticed. Thousands hurried past him. Only a handful paused, and even they did not grasp the greatness of the musician that they were hearing. One woman recognized him because she had gone to the concert the night before. Beauty was in their midst in music, and they did not behold it. The story is a parable of our spiritual perception. Zechariah calls God's people, "Behold, your king comes to you." But beholding requires more than sight. It requires recognition. At Christmas, the world once again rushes by. We're entering into that rush season. Often missing the quiet arrival of the true king comes humility. Advent invites us to stop, to pause, to perceive the glory around us. Catherine always reminds me when we're driving, like this morning, right? I'm rushing to here because we're kind of late. And she's saying, look at the trees around us, the snow. Beauty among us, waiting to be recognized, welcomed, and adored. And the king wants to be recognized in your life this morning. Jesus wants you to see that his love in the acts, in the music, in his word, in the fellowship, in the busyness, in the gifts, in the pain and the suffering that you're suffering right now. Jesus wants you to know that in your tears, he's there. He's there. He notices. We are to have joyful obedience. Our joy is not passive. It is enacted in obedience, serving, loving, forgiving, and worshiping. We have opportunities all around us. The Mississauga Food Bank, right? We're going to talk about that in the announcements. You know, I just thought of what to talk to you about during this portion of the message, and I want to tell you this. One of the greatest robbers of joy, and I know that in the church, in my life too, is a certain kind of legalism that has crept up in the church that focuses on, it's almost slavery to rules and regulations. Now, I'm not saying break the rules on purpose, but what I am saying is this. In my own life, the greatest antidote, cure, fix against that kind of legalism, which, by the way, Jesus spoke out against the most in his time on earth. The greatest enemies of his were the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes that focused on legalism. And he spoke out so much against that. That was among his greatest enemies, in a sense. He spoke out. You know what the greatest antidote to it? It's not more rules and regulations. It's not getting rid of the rules and regulations. What it is primarily is having the right perspective and vision and mission for your life. And in specifically, it is to focus on evangelism and outreach, to sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. Why? Because when confronted by unregenerate people, or people that are sinners that don't believe in Jesus, that hate God, or people that just don't care about God, when confronted with them and trying to confront them with the gospel, you're forced to define very practically, very specifically, to define the gospel and to focus on the core gospel. And then all these other rules and regulations, you interpret them in light of the core gospel, the spirit of the core gospel. You know, what is the core gospel? It's substitutionary atonement, right? Christ died for our sins, for God so loved the world. It's the, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-4. It's the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. That's the core gospel. Focusing on that. Everything else doesn't fade away, but it's redefined in light of that. And we don't have to worry about whether we know that, and that's the spirit under which we interpret things. So how do we live more as well in light of the coming King? First of all, prepare your hearts. Advent is a spiritual housekeeping. Clear space. Get rid of the clutter. Make room for Jesus, right? Embrace humility. Follow the King's example. Serve quietly. Love gently. Proclaim peace. Be agents of reconciliation in your family, your workplace, and friendships. Spread peace through everyday acts of grace. It's godly character that will help you do that. I was reading this morning, part of my devotions, Eugene Peterson's The Message, 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 3-9. And we talk about good character and adding to your faith. He puts it this way: add to your faith good character, spiritual understanding, alert discipline, passionate patience, reverent wonder, warm friendliness, generous love. Those are the things you need for this Advent season. Cultivate that in your life. And God doesn't expect you to change overnight. But pick one or two areas in which you need to cultivate humility, peace, joyfulness. Let worship, gratitude, and generosity overflow from your life. And notice very carefully the Zechariah prophecy. It is not a rejoice because you kind of feel like it. As Jordan mentioned about missions, it's a command. It's very clearly a command in Hebrew. We are to rejoice, even when it hurts, but not in a false way, but because we have reasons to really rejoice. I want you just to picture in your mind, someone who's living this out during this Advent season. Picture in your mind a woman walks into a crisis shelter, nothing but a pot of hot soup she makes for strangers, or clothing to donate. There's no fanfare, there's no platform, but in that room, hope begins to flicker. A child smiles for the first time in days. A tired mother weeps with relief. That's how Jesus' peace spreads through ordinary people living out with extraordinary love. How does the King come today? As the one who brings salvation and forgiveness and reconciliation. I read a story recently, a true story. I want to share with you that reminds me of this. In 1942, I know it's a war story, but it starts there, it ends today. An American bombardier, Jacob de Chazer, he sits in a Japanese prison, and he just finished a raid in Japan. They called it a Doolittle raid, right? He is now in this prison in Japan. He's starving, he's beaten, he's full of hatred against his captors. And one day a guard, for whatever reason, just happens to toss him a battered Bible. And in the dark cell, Jacob meets Jesus by reading the Bible. He whispers, he had this one prayer. He said, "Lord, if you save me, I'll serve you anywhere." Anywhere. And after the war, he kept his vow. He actually felt called to return to Japan. Not as a soldier, but as a missionary, preaching forgiveness to the very nation that he had bombed. And in one of his testimonies reached a Japanese former commander, Mitsu Fuchida. And the Japanese commander happened to be the guy who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, that big part of leading the U.S. into the war. And he read and heard de Chazer's forgiveness story. And he said this: "The God who forgave him could forgive me." And so he sought out Jesus and believed. And then one day, the unimaginable happened. The bomber of Tokyo and the pilot of Pearl Harbor stood face to face. They shook hands and called each other brothers. And enemies became brothers because Christ stepped between them. That's Zechariah 9 in flesh and blood today. The King who comes lowly and riding on a donkey is the King who proclaims peace to the nations. If Jesus can bring peace between two wartime enemies, he can bring peace to the places that you fear are beyond repair. In your relationships at home, your relationships at work, your relationships in the church, your relationships, your own relationship to yourself, if you're not at peace with yourself. This is Christmas. This is Zechariah's prophecy in real time. This is the King who still comes today, quietly, gently, but victoriously, for sure, guaranteed. And he comes into the lives of those who receive him. Are you ready to do that? Let me close this in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for sending Jesus, our humble and triumphant King. Like the cry of, O come, Emmanuel, we wait for you, the one who comes to ransom and rescue your people, the one who meets us in our captivity and leads us into freedom. Open our eyes, Lord, to behold him, prepare our hearts to receive him with fresh wonder. Heal our homes, restore our relationships, Lord. Quiet our fears, mend every broken and hidden place within us. Let your peace rule in us. Let your joy overflow through us. Come, Lord Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us. Amen.